entire team. It's been such a joy working with all of you, Carrie, Dania, Amy, and Scott. They work so hard. The Connect team is amazing as well. Alberta, all you guys are incredible. So first and foremost, the only reason I'm here is because you have found a way to make this happen. So I just want to say thank you to all of you hardworking behind the scenes folks from the bottom of my heart. Thank you so much, all of you, and what a team. So next I want to say thank you to you. Thank you for all of you working in the field of intellectual disabilities. Oh my goodness, thank you so much. It has been so hard. I know what you are going through. Maybe I don't know what you're going through, right? I can only imagine in the time of COVID, with working with folks with 10,000 issues, already having suffered from loneliness and isolation, and now we're back into isolation, and the struggles that you have had, I can't even imagine. So for all of you listening today, from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for the work you are doing. Where would we be without you? Thank you for the people directly supporting folks, and thank you for the supporters of the supporters, right? You guys are wonderful because everybody needs support right now. And what I want to talk about today really comes from my own journey. And my own journey has been an interesting one, and it's been full of mistakes, right? Full of mistakes. And that's what I've learned the most from. So I began, I got my master's in psychology and I started doing therapy with folks in a clinic. And I kept thinking to myself, why are they paying me? Don't you have a friend? Why would you ask me what you should do with your life? I have no idea. And I thought I was like a really nice, compassionate person. And I wasn't as nice as I thought I was, because I'd be like, you're getting on my nerves. Just get it together. So I found out that I wasn't really the therapist I hoped I would be. I've gotten better since then. Age helps a lot. But I was like, I can't help these people. And so I started looking and said, okay, I've got this master's degree and I'm single and I'm poor and I'm in debt, and I better find out how I can make a living without feeling like I'm a big phony, because that's how I was feeling. So I tried different jobs. I worked with the homeless for a while in Baltimore City. That was incredibly depressing. It's like, oh, I'm not cut out for this either. And I interviewed again, and I was interviewing for this job, and it was a place called Maryland Homes for the Handicapped. Maryland Homes for the Handicapped, right? Like, that's a crazy name, not very politically correct. I was like, what is everybody in wheelchairs? What is this? Well, I went in and I'm looking for the wheelchairs and I'm sitting in the lobby, but it's one person after another who's very colorful. And I was really enjoying talking to people. One guy came up to me, this big guy, goes, I got a girlfriend, just like he had caught a fish. He's like, I got one. I'm like, really? He's like, yeah, I'm going to marry her. I'm like, oh, that's so nice. Have you been dating? Oh, no, we don't date. We just get married. Okay. And then this other woman said to me, I need a sponsor. She had a glass eye and she had another eye pointing up this way, and she was in quite a state. And she said, I need a sponsor. I need a sponsor to take me to church. Everybody has a sponsor taking them to church. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'll take you to church. I just became a Buddhist. I chant Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, but what the heck? Let's go to church. She just touched something inside of me. And I just kept talking to the people in the lobby, and I was like, I think I found my people. I think I solved my problem. So I went in and I gave that interview everything I had. You know how you go and you turn it on? I turned it on. I am the one for the job. I can do this. I've got this. I've got that. I am the one. And I got the job. Well, later on, I found out that I was the only applicant. It was a behavior specialist position. And then I found out that I was also the janitorial instructor. Oh, well, right? You got to do what you got to do. So that's okay. I started the first week with the janitorial crew. So the first week was very important to me. And anybody that's heard me speak has probably heard this story, because this is my defining story for my work in the field of disability. And it began that first week. And here's what happened. I was supposed to shadow the instructor. His name was Kelly, and I was there with him and shadowing him. And we were working in 3 separate churches, which were all small churches, part of one big church. There was actually one big church and 2 little ones. And Father Joe ran them all. And every time I saw Father Joe, I tried to introduce myself because I wanted him to know I was taking over the janitorial crew, and Kelly got a promotion, right? So I kept saying, Father Joe, hi, Father Joe. And Father Joe would just walk right past me and not respond. I say it again. Hi, Father Joe. My name is Karyn. Ignored me. We're walking in the hallway. He's coming up. I'm coming down. I start talking. He walks right past me. I asked Kelly, does Father Joe have a hearing problem? And Kelly said, no, he hears perfectly fine. So I was like, So the next day, which by then was Wednesday, explained everything. So what happened was that day, I was there with the guys and we had our lunch break. So we're all sitting eating our lunch. Father Joe walks in. He was a very stately man with a salt and pepper beard and salt and pepper hair and very upright. And he walks in the room, he has quite a presence. And all the guys on the crew start saying, hi, Father Joe. Hey, Father Joe. And I say, hi, Father Joe. And he looks at all of us and he just keeps walking, right? And then he walks over to Kelly. He says, hey, Kelly, how are you? How you doing? How was your weekend? And they start talking. And I realized that he thought I was one of the crew, which is easy to do if you get to know me. He thought that I was one of the folks on the crew, and they just kept trying to talk to him. He's leaving and they're still like, Father Joe, Father Joe. They didn't give up. And I was like, oh my gosh, they're invisible. And they're so marginalized. They're the ones doing all the work. And yet Father Joe, and Father Joe wasn't a bad guy. This was just the way it was. So that was 30 years ago. And I would love to say that, isn't it great that things are different now? But they're not, at least not where I come from. I don't know how many of you have taken somebody with a disability out to eat or to the mall, and they talk with you and they ignore that person. Maybe they ask you what that person wants to eat, or they give you the change when that person pays. Maybe it's just the States, but I see a lot of marginalization. And being invisible is tough. And I realized that, wow. And so I went to the psychologist supervising me because at that time I was in Maryland with a master's degree, and you couldn't do work as a psychologist, a master's level psychologist, without being on the license of a PhD. So I kept going to the PhD, Dr. B. I kept saying, Dr. B, Dr. B, I think these people need therapy. They really need support. They really go through a lot. And he said, oh, no, we don't do therapy with people. He used the R word. Everyone used the R word back then. We don't do therapy with these people. We do behavior modification. So I started doing it on the slide, right? Like, come here, come here. How are you feeling? What's going on? Tell me more. And people loved that and wanted to talk. And then I started to realize that the best staff who were most effective were the ones who were listening, were the ones who really sat down with folks, right? And I realized people needed support on an emotional level. And I kept going back to the psychologist. In the meantime, I'm supposed to write behavior plans, and I'm writing behavior plans. And I'm writing some behavior plans that didn't really work. And I have a lot of stories about that because we missed the boat. So there I am. And I finally decide, well, I have to go back to school. I have to pay a lot of money and get tortured so that people will listen to me because I always have a lot to say. And I went back to school, got my degree, started supervising, working in agencies still, supervising other psych associates, and we all did a lot of therapy. And we wrote behavior plans, but we had a little bit more of a holistic approach, did our best. And doing the therapy, we heard one trauma story after another, over and over again. We heard about sexual abuse. We heard about physical abuse. And we would talk afterwards and we would debrief because these were hard stories to hear. And then I realized I've got to learn about trauma because just about everybody I'm talking to has had some level of trauma. And as it turns out, that trauma is the elephant in the room in the world of intellectual disabilities. I bet all of you know somebody with an intellectual disability who has a history of being sexually abused or emotionally abused, being bullied or excluded, or all of the above, not to mention other types of abuse. So I started realizing that what I saw and what I was writing plans for as behavior problems actually in many cases were symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, and that I had been getting it wrong. And so as I studied more and more trauma and learned more about trauma, I started looking at the major question at hand, which is, how do people heal? How can we support? How can we help in the healing? How can we not shame people for the symptoms of their trauma? How can we programmatically provide supports? And what can we do moving forward? And I saw that a big piece of that was teaching people about trauma so that we can all understand. And the truth is, life on planet Earth is hard. We all know at least something about trauma. We've all been through something. Very few people haven't. Even the royal family, look at that little pair that had to move to Canada. Notice they didn't come to America. Meghan and Harry. Everybody's got something. So folks with disabilities have a little extra. Nora Belladarian in 2013 published a wonderful piece of research. She interviewed over 7,600 people, and she asked them, have you been physically, sexually, or financially abused? Over 70% said they had been abused. They had. 90% said the abuse had been ongoing, and only 37% reported it to the police because people felt like nothing would be done, or there wasn't enough proof because the reporting was too late, or whatever. We've all seen it, right? I was very fortunate to be a part of an NPR series and meet Joe Shapiro, who is an amazing man. He wrote the book No Pity years ago and then became a journalist for NPR and did a very intensive special on the sexual abuse of people with intellectual disabilities that you can find in the NPR archives. And he said that he went to the Bureau of Statistics in the States and asked them to print a report on the sexual abuse, incidents of rape, molestation of people with disabilities versus people without, and intellectual disabilities solely. And they came back to him with their report and said people with intellectual disabilities were 7 times more likely to be sexually abused than people without. That's horrible, right? Well, I'm sure many of you know people who have been. And I've heard story after story. 2017, the Bureau of Justice published a report that said people with disabilities were 2.5 times more likely to be the victims of violent crimes. And it was more likely that the perpetrator was someone that they knew, 40% more likely than people without disabilities. So these severe disabilities have gone on severe abuse. Then of people with disabilities. Then we look at the social trauma. You know, I was thinking this morning before I was doing this, I was like, but people in Canada are so nice. If I talk about bullying like goes on here in the States, maybe they won't relate. But we know kids can be cruel, and that's all over the world. And just about everybody I know with a disability has been called the R word, has been bullied, has been picked on, has been laughed at, and has been excluded. Maybe less in Canada, but I know it still happened. And being left out actually causes physical pain. Studies have shown being institutionalized, especially those folks who are older and what they have been through. Repeated foster care placements, the rejection of being, taken out of another placement. Oh, we didn't like his behavior, putting in another one, put in another one. So many sources of trauma for people with disabilities. And there's big T trauma that we all recognize, like sexual abuse, physical abuse. But then the little T traumas, being discriminated against because of your race or nationality, your origin, witnessing violence, being excluded from family. So many sources. And oftentimes, if we don't see the big trauma, we miss the fact that the little traumas have added up to create their own post-traumatic stress disorder. Research of Francine Shapiro, who developed EMDR, which is a type of trauma therapy, really shows this. We've had a lot of trauma with COVID. We've had the big T trauma of loss and grief. So I was meeting with an agency yesterday. I was consulting, and they told me in their agency of, they have maybe 800 folks, 5 died. Now that doesn't seem like a lot, but they said they were people everybody knew, and it was a big impact. 5 died of COVID, 3 staff died. So they lost 8 people, and that was very impactful. In the state of Maryland, we've lost over 45 people with intellectual disabilities at this point, and around 20 staff all died. So this is trauma that we've never, ever experienced before. And we need to be gentle with each other, right? And then there's the little T trauma of COVID, being isolated, right? So many aspects. Bessel van der Kolk talks about the little T, he calls it the pre-trauma conditions, that we can't predict what's going on. It's very tough. Nobody knows when they wake up what the rules are. The rules keep changing, right, you guys? Well, we're going back to school. No, we're not going back to school. We're hybrid. Okay, what's that mean? We're not going back to work. We're working from home. Okay, we're working all the time. Now we're working more than ever. Okay, now we're supposed to go back. We don't know what's next. And that's very hard for our executive functioning. So we might find ourselves very tired. We're working differently. I'm talking into a computer in my TV room. Yes, that's weird. I can't be in my office because we had to have the roof fixed and people are drilling right now. This is life. You might hear a little bit banging and I apologize. But what's next? I can't predict it. We're isolated. We're mobile. We lose that sense of safety or assurance. And many folks have loss of, in particular, folks with disabilities, many of them have lost their jobs. Even if it was a very small job or a role in a day program, that was very significant. And they've lost that sense of purpose, which is very impactful. So this is a very tough time. We have to be extra gentle with each other. Even just hearing about somebody who died is its own kind of trauma, let alone knowing someone, right? And watching television and seeing the news. So this is a tough time where we really have to understand that everybody is going through it. I think you already know this. This isn't news to you, but it impacts us and it impacts the folks we support. I think more than we realize. I believe very strongly that we will be dealing with the fallout and the trauma of this pandemic for a long time. And its impact is going to be far-reaching. And people are going to have a hard time re-entering and trusting and resuming and community is going to look different. So, we have to figure that out step by step, but it takes its toll. We are going to heal. So interesting, two neuropsychologists, right? One Lieberman and one Eisenberg, both doing very important work. And Lieberman pointed out that loneliness has an actual neurological impact. Our brain is wired for two things. So we know, now we do brain scans constantly while we're doing research, and we can see which part of the brain lights up, which part focuses on certain things. And Lieberman says, very rarely does the entire brain light up. Like you're totally focused. Every aspect of your brain is zipping along, focusing on one thing, right? Usually we're thinking about, like you might be thinking about what you're going to eat for lunch. Why would anyone paint their walls that crazy color yellow? And what am I actually saying, right? We can do a lot of things at once, but for the brain to totally focus, it focuses, Lieberman said, on two main issues. The first one, first and foremost, our brain will focus on meeting our physical needs. So if we're hungry, that's all we can think about, right? We may get hangry, like rah, 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 until you get some food. And I hope nobody gets like that towards the end. So if you do, just go get something to eat. And then at the end of my talk, I mean. And then the second one is social interaction. Our brain completely lights up and focuses on connecting with others. The more isolated we are, the more we seek connection. And, the irony is that our brain may be focused on it and seeking it, but the other tendency is that once we're isolated, we somehow also tend to withdraw more and more and more, like we lose hope. And that's when we can become depressed. That's when we can kind of go down that rabbit hole of negative thinking. So we need that interaction to stay mentally healthy. And yet this is a very difficult time. In particular, it's a difficult time for everyone, but it's really tough for folks with disabilities who are now, in many cases, in many places that I speak all from one place, Lutherville, Maryland, but in many places on my computer, I hear about people who aren't going anywhere or doing anything because we are so worried about them getting COVID, understandable, but they're getting more and more isolated. And that's very tough. And Eisenberger, that was Lieberman, Eisenberger did a study where she was able to demonstrate that being excluded, being left out, actually makes your brain fire in the pain center. It hurts to be left out. And here's a little neuropsychological gossip. Those two hooked up. Wouldn't you know it? It's a neuropsychological romance. They got married. I read it in Rolling Stone. It's true. So they both proved how painful it is to be isolated and how important it is to stay connected. Now, isolation is one of the biggest problems in our field. David Petoniak is so eloquent about explaining the impact of that isolation. That's why we have to figure out how to connect people. Actually, I'm working with one agency in Maryland, in the Maryland area. They were able to get a grant to do groups, and they were able to find ways to get folks devices. They got two separate grants. One grant got, pretty cheap, but, usable iPads. They got iPads or notebooks for folks. And then we started groups. So since July, I've been doing group therapy. We have 3 separate groups, and it's been amazing how people have been connecting with each other. Then they've learned how to do Zoom with each other, how to connect. And we've got a couple of hookups going on, not physical, as you can imagine, but at least there's romance. And we're able to help people kind of break that isolation through doing these 3 groups every week. And other people are doing other things. I know another group that's having weekly dance parties and having, social time and then dance. There's all kinds of ways we can fight this. Back to trauma. I don't want to cheer you up too much. No, don't leave me. We're going to end on a good note. Tomorrow, there's going to be lots of good stuff if you stick with me. But I do have some sad stories today because you have sad stories also. I know you do, right? We know what people go through. And the thing about the sad story I'm about to tell you about betrayal trauma is that I blame the agency and myself. This is Tamika, and she wanted me to tell her story, and she gave me permission. She actually asked me to tell her story. I did crisis counseling with her after she was raped. And betrayal trauma is a type of trauma that psychologists are talking a lot about these days. And we see it a lot. And when I started reading about it, it just affirmed so much work I had done in the past, because I have done a lot of crisis counseling with people after a sexual assault. I'm a therapist. And I work predominantly with folks with intellectual disabilities, as I told you earlier, because I can't relate to normal people. If you knew me, you'd understand. You're getting to know me, aren't you? So I have heard over and over again how people were most devastated by the fact that they thought the person who raped them was really their boyfriend. And to call it rape was so upsetting because they were going to get married. So this one woman I worked with years ago, her house manager had sex with her every single night for several months before she told her mom. Then she finally told her mom, said, I'm getting married and I'm so excited and I'm trying to get pregnant now. And she didn't realize that her mom had forced her to have her tubes tied, and that's what that operation was when she was 14. And she was trying with him to get pregnant so they could have a family. He knew what he was doing, and he was married. And they went to court, and her most upsetting moment was in court where they said, this was rape, he was married, he's going to jail. And she's like, rape? Married? We were going to get married. And that was the real core of her trauma. And I kept thinking about it. And then I started, and I kept coming across this kind of thing over and over. And then I read about betrayal trauma, where the worst piece of the trauma is that you've been tricked, that somebody knowingly deceived you, made a fool of you. And that's its own type of trauma on top of the assault. So Tamika always wanted a boyfriend. That's all she ever talked about, was how she wanted a boyfriend. And, she had a boyfriend at a day program, but this is a very sad version of a relationship. You sit next to each other at the day program, never dated. Mom wouldn't let him. And we didn't really pursue it like we should have. Then she switched day programs because she was able to work a few hours a week at the second day program. She did some work and got paid for it. And she kept saying she wanted a boyfriend. She wanted a boyfriend. Didn't work out with Michael. Didn't work out with Michael. She wanted a boyfriend. Do we listen? Do we really hear what was the most important thing to her? No. And I was so full of myself because I was running a singles group. Yes. And I was helping people to meet and to connect. We had, 2 cruises a year. I would like to say we went to, the Bahamas, but really we just went in a circle around the Baltimore Inner Harbor. Everybody had one drink and they were home in time for meds. So maybe it wasn't as glamorous as it could have been, but I was helping people get relationships, but everybody forgot about Tamika because Tamika didn't advocate for herself. Didn't have staff that really supported her going anywhere because the 2 ladies she lived with never wanted to do anything and kept saying she wanted a boyfriend. And she got independent time at one point, and she was walking in her neighborhood every day, and this man saw her and started talking to her, pulled over his car, offered her a ride, gave her $1 to go to the dollar store. Do you guys have the dollar store? You buy everything for $1. It's kind of fun. And it's cheap. And he was grooming her. And she said to her staff, I have a boyfriend. I have a boyfriend. She was so excited. None of us checked it out. And then he brutally raped her. And she came home really hurt, took her to the hospital, got the evidence. And she kept saying, but this is what you have to do when you have a boyfriend, right? If she had had a boyfriend, if we had heard her and helped her connect with different people that she said she liked, or advocated more for her, or supported her in those skills, she would have said to that man, I have a boyfriend. I'm not getting in that car. But no. So somehow we make people more vulnerable and put them at higher risk through this isolation. And I blame myself as well as, you know, our whole agency, that we weren't listening. And I did the crisis counseling with her afterwards, and she really bounced back. And we did a lot of EMDR, that's a trauma type of therapy, and it was very effective in processing it. And then she said, I'm going to get a boyfriend and I'm going to get married, and this is what I want in my life. And we started really working on the social skills of ways to do that, and people she might like and how to approach them. And then after 6 months, she said, I'm done now. She was done with me. And then she said to me, but tell people about me and about what happened. I don't want it to happen to them. And so I am. Okay. There was an interesting study done about neglect. I think neglect is something we haven't really looked at. And yet, how many of you work with someone who was neglected in the early years? You know, I know there's a lot of fetal alcohol syndrome. And my heart goes out to folks, because the person with the alcohol problem, more often than not, they're self-medicating their own trauma. But it's very hard to be a functional parent. There's many aspects of neglect, but it happens a lot. So what are the effects of neglect? This is really important. Nathan Fox did an interesting study where he went to Romania, and he went to Bucharest to an orphanage that was very poor. And they were not getting nurtured or supported. These little babies, and he took kids from 6 months old to 5 and placed half of them in a foster care setting. And he trained parents in that foster care setting to be very nurturing and supportive. And then, so that's a random selection, half. And then the other half were left in the orphanage, where there weren't a lot of staff, and they were pretty neglected. And here's the results. Those left in the institution, 55% qualified as having some thought or mood disorder, some serious access 1 disorder. 35% of the foster care kids, so that went way down. Emotional disorders, 49% versus 29%, way down. Behavioral disorders, 32% versus 25%. Not as much of a decrease, because people often don't have behavioral issues when they're all just shut down, when what we call dissociated, right? They're just frozen. Most importantly for us, the average IQ of those children left in the orphanage was 73 versus those in the foster care setting, 85. That's a 12-point difference in IQ. You know, the executive functioning is damaged through trauma. The brain doesn't even develop properly. And there was also gray matter in the brain actually shrunk in the children left. It shrank each year, the children left in the orphanage. They had lower brain activity measured by the EEG, impairments in executive functioning, increased adrenaline levels, because that brain was saying, I'm in danger, and filling up with chemicals, often abnormally physically small, failure to thrive, and there were a number of premature deaths. This is the reality. Neglect is devastating. Think about the folks that you've worked with. How many got that interaction they needed? We as humans have critical developmental periods in which if we don't get that interaction, our brain doesn't get wired up the way it needs to be. So if we were live having a good time and I was escaping from America to Canada, I would be showing you videos, but I'm so worried to show videos on my computer because I so often mess it up. So we're not going to do that, because then getting back on the screen, you know how it goes. But there is a great video, Children Raised by Animals, where you see a mirror neuron, and you've probably read, have you seen stories about a little baby dropped off in the forest, maybe in the 1800s, and raised by wolves? And that kid at like 7 years old walks on all fours and howls, and no one can get them to walk upright or, speak. Because at the critical developmental periods, our brain has to have a certain type of stimulation to be able to be wired up to behave in a human-like way. Humanic, I made that word up. So it sounds like a drug company. So, and the same thing. So for if there was a wolf howling at you, ooh, and you're at that critical developmental period, you're going to start howling. So, but if you're neglected, nothing gets wired. So the great thing is we've learned about neuroplasticity, in which the brain will rewire when it gets proper stimulation, but it takes a long, long time. And I bet there's a lot of you out there that know this already, because I bet a lot of you have worked with folks that have had severe neglect or severe abuse, and they've been off the hook. And yet, by being somebody safe, by helping them to feel cared for and nurtured, they've calmed down and they've started maybe able to think better, more clearly. How many of you have worked with somebody who you didn't think used words, and then they started speaking all of a sudden? It was because they finally felt safe. Selective mutism is a symptom of trauma. So, we don't know what we don't know, and we don't always know people's history. We don't know what happened at those critical developmental periods, and we don't know how gifted and inherently intelligent people are. How many of you know someone who's really smart, but they're diagnosed with an intellectual disability? I know 100 people. Now I'm going to ask you, think about that person, right? Do they have a trauma history? My guess is that they do. It reminds me of my good friend, Michael Joseph Henderson. And I was working with this one woman who had fetal alcohol syndrome, but all I ever heard from her family was about how great her mother was and how wonderful a family they were. And she kept teasing people and fighting with people and doing all kinds of things. And I had a behavior plan that first gave her a soda every day that she didn't tease someone. She never got that darn soda. And then she'd get really mad. Where's my soda? Where's my soda? Then we upped the ante and we gave her a little $5 certificate to go to the mall. Her brother paid for it. And again, she never earned that certificate. I just set her up. Because Michael Joseph Henderson was the smartest person I knew. He was in our program. He was a person with a disability. And he told me, he said, I am only in this program because of evil psychologists. And I said, evil psychologists? That's the first time I met him. He told me that. And it was a program for people with dual diagnosis of mental health issues and intellectual disability. And I said, evil psychologists? He said, yep, they gave me a test and it got me upset. And it had blocks and it had numbers, and I got mad and I got upset. And then they said I was the R word. And he was right. And then he wanted to know what my job was there. And I'm like, I'm just staff. And the staff were right behind him going, don't listen to him. He's schizophrenic. Well, he was diagnosed as paranoid schizophrenic, right? But the reality was, he had severe PTSD. And let me tell you, I found out after months and months of getting to know him, finally doing counseling with him. And that counseling took a long time before you can do counseling with people for a while before you really know and before you hear the real story. And he finally told me, after about 8 months of counseling, that he'd been passed around for much of his childhood as a sex toy between his mother, his stepfather, and his uncle. Never ever seen as a person. And he was very traumatized, but very smart. And that woman I told you about that was always starting fights, one day Michael said to me, you know what? She's got an alcohol face. I was like, what? You're right. She had, the whole look, half open eyes, lowered lids, like always tired, and that flat philtrum. And I was like, how did I not see that? And I asked her, we'll call her Mary. Mary, did your mom like to drink? Oh, she loved to drink. She drank all the time. Okay, then. But Michael was so smart, understood everything going on, and never responded to the medication for schizophrenia because he was paranoid and appeared paranoid because he couldn't trust the people he was supposed to trust early in his life. Couldn't trust anyone, his mother, his stepfather, his uncle. And yet he was brilliant in so many ways and knew it and kept saying, I don't belong here. But then someone would say the wrong thing to him and he would get triggered and he would get upset and he would throw things. And they would say, see, you're having a bad behavior. You're a behavior problem. You just lost your trip. When he was actually being triggered and his reaction was hyperarousal, a symptom of trauma. And someone pushed that button, boom, he was triggered. And his brain was telling him he was in danger and he was freaking out. And that would happen periodically. And he never responded to the meds, which was always a sign. So when the meds don't work and the behavior plan doesn't work, we have to look at trauma. So in the States, we have a lot of folks now in their late 20s and 30s who've been exposed to cocaine. And that cocaine is in utero damage. Then we have the cocaine methamphetamine. We have the methamphetamine alcohol combination, and we see very similar patterns with the cocaine and methamphetamine. We see people who are very smart, who are socially aware and very good with expressive language, but have a lot of difficulty processing, a lot of difficulty focusing, and severe impulse control. So I know in many areas that you're in, we see a lot of fetal alcohol syndrome. Mary had a great deal of trouble connecting cause and effect. So my behavior plan was horrible because it relied on her knowing that if she teased someone, she wasn't going to get her soda. And if she started a fight or fought with someone, she wasn't going to get the soda. And then she wasn't going to go to the mall. And it just got her frustrated because she didn't understand cause and effect, because that's what the alcohol damages. It damages your ability to sequentially reason. I bet you guys have had a lot of training on that. And what I'm saying is very superficial on one level, but it's very significant because we are looking at biological damage when we see that in utero trauma, that drug or alcohol exposure. And then we expect people to be a certain way when they can't. And the tragedy of both the alcohol and the drug exposure, I mean, it's all tragic and horrible because you see who that person would have been. But the damage is very specific. So people will often have good language skills. They can usually read or write maybe at a second or third grade level. There's a lot of skill, but the skill is in making the appearance of understanding. And so people think they're being manipulative when they actually don't get it because the processing or the receptive and understanding skills aren't there. That's what's damaged. That and that connecting that cause and effect, as well as that impulse control, right? Executive functioning. But they can talk really well. They can say things that everybody expects them to say, but not really get it. So that's why we need to slow it down, explain, take our time, and understand that folks are very committed to looking like they get it because there's that social awareness that I'm not a part of the world and I want to be a part of it. So being accommodating becomes the most important thing so that folks can be a part of this world in the way that they want to be. Understanding there's a reality of biological damage that's real. And the workaround is the most important thing. Let's look at trauma. How are you guys doing? If you need to take a break, take a break. Do what you need to do, because I'm going to keep talking. Because I'm really into it, as you can probably tell. I'm obsessed. So the brain does not look like this, but it's easy to divide our brain up to explain it. So we have our smart brain. We talked about that earlier, our executive functioning, right? That plans and thinks things through. So like when your boss says something really dumb, you want to say, that's the stupidest thing I ever heard. But instead you're like, and your smart part of your brain says, remember your car payment. You guys might have trucks up there. Remember that truck payment? And you just say, well, good idea. And you don't say anything else because you want to keep that job. The limbic system, the yellow part of the brain, has your sympathetic nervous system and your parasympathetic nervous system. Your sympathetic nervous system is the part of the brain that responds to danger, right? That's your amygdala, right? That flashes, and we've heard about this, we know about this, fight, flight, or freeze. So this worked really well when we were cavemen. So when we were cavemen and hanging out in the jungle and this big furry thing came up, we're like, oh, that's so cute. And then the furry thing ate one of our kids. Oh my God, right? Our amygdala takes a picture of it and remembers it. And the next time we're out there hanging out with the family and we see the furry thing, now we have a name for it. That's a lion. And our amygdala starts flashing, danger, danger, danger. And we say, let's get them, boys. And we either kill them or we get the kids and we run, right? We do whatever we have to do to protect ourselves. Or we freeze if we're just a tiny little old lady who can't really fight a lion and run too fast. I'm dead, because we are the only animal that eats dead animals. So that worked really well. And our amygdala would tell us we were in danger and fill us up with chemicals, adrenaline and cortisol, and we could run. Woohoo! Get out of the way. Or kill him. But now our amygdala starts flashing and we got nowhere to go. We watch TV and it's like, ooh, things look really bad. I'd like to fight someone. Maybe we argue with our wife or husband or yell at the kids. Not you guys. I know you don't do that. Or maybe we just zone out. That's something a lot of us have been doing, right? Choop, freeze. And what just happened for the last hour? What did I watch on TV? Where did I go? What am I doing? Or we find ways to get out of town, even though we're in the same place. Well, I'll just go to a different room and pretend I'm not here. So fight, flight, or freeze. And what happens is we can't, when we think we're in danger, we can't calm ourselves down rationally, because your smart brain, your green part of your brain, your neocortex, when you're in danger, it goes offline, right? And your reptilian brain, that's no help, because that's the part that just keeps the heart pumping and things going, like your brainstem. So that's not helping you. The only thing that can calm you down is feeling safe. That's why when we have people we're working with that are freaking out, that are attacking or throwing something or doing something, and we say, oh, this is me. I told staff to tell them to put that chair down there, or else they'll lose their soda. And instead they throw the chair and punch the staff. I don't want to lose my soda. Dave Petoniak says, that's when you really need a soda, is when you're having a bad day. But the reality is that response is a trauma response. The person isn't doing it to try to hurt their staff or hurt someone else. Their amygdala is telling them they're in danger. And the only thing that can calm them down is the parasympathetic nervous system, not their rational brain. And the parasympathetic nervous system is the part that breathes, cools down, and that's the part that only kicks in when you feel safe. And when you're emotionally, psychologically, and physically safe, it kicks in and says, okay, we don't have to respond now. We're all right. Not when you rationalize, because there's a very weak signal from the smart brain to the amygdala. There's a very strong signal from the amygdala to the smart brain. The amygdala will put you in high alert in a minute, and you can't calm yourself down until you really know you're safe. Sounds like being a human being, right? So that's a reality of being a human being. Now let's think about the folks we support. How many times are their amygdalas telling them that they're not safe? You know, I work with this one guy, and you don't know what somebody's triggers are. The amygdala might see something that reminds them of something unsafe, which is actually perfectly fine. And people might put themselves in more danger. So actually, this guy, I've seen several situations like this. We were working with him. He was out of the institution, Rosewood. He was there for 40 years. He had just come out, and he was fine about 80% of the time. And then at 20% of the time, all of a sudden he would just start screaming and flipping tables and just be completely not there till we'd get a very glassy-eyed look. And we couldn't calm him down. And if we told him he was going to lose his soda, we'd get a chair thrown at us. You know, nothing worked. We did our functional assessment. Was that for attention? No, he was getting plenty of attention. Was it to escape a demand situation? No, there was no demand. Was it communication? No, he wasn't communicating anything. Yes, he was inadvertently communicating, but that wasn't his intent. When he wanted to communicate, he looked us in the eye and said he maybe had a 10-word vocabulary, and he said things. We couldn't figure it out. It wasn't entertainment or stimulation because he was in a state of total fear. And then we finally figured it out. Every time the program manager walked in the room, he would start freaking out. And that's when he would lose it. And she was a lovely woman, so we never made that connection until finally somebody said, you know, it's when Donna comes in. Donna had straight blonde hair, was very tall. And we just figured there must have been somebody who looked just like Donna who was very abusive towards him. Because his amygdala saw Donna and flashed that he was going to get hurt. And the best defense is a good offense. 99% of the aggression I've seen, and I've worked with folks for many years, and I have been around a lot of incidents, 99% has been out of fear, not out of an intent to hurt someone. I want to tell you about that 1%. It's a bad story. Oh, well. But 99%. And that's what it was with Dan. Dan saw her, and she reminded him of somebody. And we will never know the story. You don't have to know the story to know that it's a trauma response and to know that the task at hand is to help that person feel safe, to help that parasympathetic nervous system kick in and calm the person down. They have to know emotionally and psychologically that they're safe. It's not a rational thing. Dan, you're safe, you're fine. No, I'm not. He's screaming, throwing things. But when she left, after about 20 minutes, he'd finally calmed down. So we reorganized our program so he never saw her. But she would talk to him on the phone. And that was funny because they had nice talks on the phone because it wasn't her. It was someone that looked like her. Our amygdala tells us we're in danger and sometimes places us in more danger. I've known other people who have just run into the road as soon as they saw somebody because they thought that person was going to hurt them. They put themselves in more danger because their amygdala is not rational. It's saying, oh no, there's that person. Run. How many of you have seen this? That trigger response. And this is what we're often looking at when we look at behavioral issues, and we don't always know it, right? That fight, flight, or freeze. Attachment issues come up too. People get very needy. I need you, I need you, I need you. How many of you know someone like that? They have an incident, and then after that, they have to talk to you every minute. Or they have shame. I'm a bad person. I'm sorry, constantly apologizing. Over and over and over. That's a trauma response. Oftentimes, people who have been abused internalize their abuse and hate themselves, turn it on themselves. I'm working with somebody right now, And she spent several years cutting, cutting herself. And I'll tell you how it all happened. She had a lot of trauma history. She was, her mother was pregnant and did drugs and was arrested, incarcerated, and put in jail. Welcome to Baltimore. Ridiculous. And so she had the baby in jail. And so there was some drug effects. We'll call this young woman Linda. And Linda was given to a sister of the mother who didn't want her. And Linda cried a lot, possibly pertaining to the fact that she was born addicted to cocaine. Well, actually, the cocaine damage was there, but there was, I'm sorry, she wasn't addicted at birth, but the damage had been done. But she cried a lot. And the woman shook her so hard that she's now legally blind. And the woman was put in jail. So Linda had shaken baby syndrome and had a mother in jail and was put in foster care, was abused in a foster care, physically abused in a foster care setting. Then finally was reunited with her mother, and her brother began sexually abusing her. So she told, this was as a teenager, and she told, and the family turned on her. This is a hard story, sorry about that. But it has a good ending. There's always a good ending. Oh, okay, I take that back. Most of the time there's a good ending. I'm working on it. I'm working on the ending with Linda, but she's doing really good, except for one thing I'll tell you later. But in any case, the family turned on her. So she was bowling with staff. She aged into the adult system. She was in a group home, or actually we call them ALUs. There were 3 people, and she was bowling with staff. And 2 lanes down, there was her family having a birthday party for her nephew. How upsetting, right? Because they didn't invite her. They were, everything they did to exclude her. And she went up to them really upset. Why don't you ever invite me? What? And her cousin cursed her out. Look what you did. And he went into juvenile, blah, 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 residence because of you, because you said that stuff. And Linda went home and started cutting. And the staff said, oh, she's doing it for attention. We can't just always jump to that conclusion. She was in pain. And I would have been too. Anyone would have been. And so for about 2 years, she really cut herself. She became suicidal periodically. She had a number of hospitalizations. And I was working with her. And we were doing EMDR. And through about a year of EMDR and a year of working on positive identity development, getting her a sense of self and supporting her, she started to come out of it. And then she realized she didn't like where she lived, and the staff were very demeaning to her, and they were. And she was able to advocate for herself and got herself moved to a different agency. And I am happy to tell you that she has got a job working childcare. So she is an aide in a actually it's a daycare for kids with disabilities, and it's so fantastic. And she has reconnected with her mom and has a good relationship with her mom now. So now this is maybe about 8 years of therapy, and her getting that empowerment to be able to speak up for herself, to get herself moved to a different home, to a different agency where people heard her, and get herself the support she wanted. The bad thing is she has COVID right now. That wasn't too good. Oh, well, there's always something. But the good news is she doesn't have a very severe case. I was just on the phone with her yesterday. She can't taste, she can't smell, but she doesn't have a fever. Most of this story is really good because she said, I can't wait to get back to work. It just made me so happy. And she's been dating on and off this year, so that's new too. So people do heal when we get what's actually the problem. If we just kept looking at her as someone who's cutting because she wanted attention, we would just keep shaming her. Well, oh, look, you did it again. And we would have, our positive behavior plan where you didn't get your reward today. And that would not have been enough. So, she's come a long way. She's fought really hard. When she realized that could, she could have the life she wanted. And when she started having hope and having a vision of a life that she could have, and she had a really good job coach too, who helped her a long road of getting that job. And people do heal. That trauma moment is not, it's people actually often regress in their age, and they just kind of go to when they first had their trauma. Dan Siegel says that. And it's not the teachable moment. It's not the time to tell someone they're being manipulative, or what are you doing wrong right now, what you should be doing, because that's not getting in. You're appealing to the rational mind. And then there's also that message like you're a bad person for doing this behavior. And we don't want to do that. The amygdala actually becomes enlarged when you've had repeated trauma over childhood. There was a study done with children who grew up in war-torn Bosnia, and they saw enlarged amygdalas and shrunken hippocampi. I learned how to say that. Hippocampi is the plural of hippocampus. And your hippocampus is your working memory. So when something in the brain enlarges, something else has to shrink. So if people have had a lot of trauma, that amygdala that says you're in danger and emits your danger signals gets enlarged, right? Children in war-torn Bosnia had large amygdalas because they saw war all the time. They replicated that study with children who grew up in the States in gang-infested areas where they saw people getting killed and they lost relatives and things like that. Enlarged amygdalas. And that means your hippocampus shrinks, and your hippocampus is your working memory. So it makes it more difficult to learn. Yeah. So again, you think about that person who's so smart, and yet they're diagnosed with an intellectual disability. Well, it's hard when your working memory has shrunk and you're taught something and you can't remember it to implement it. That behavior is on the tip of the iceberg, but so often for so many years, we've focused on that. That's just a symptom in many cases. That there's the emotion underneath. And then trauma underneath that very frequently. And have you noticed the staff that are the best? I bet all of you can think of a staff person who you can give anybody to. And they can work with that person, and in a matter of weeks and then months, that person calms down. No matter how off the hook they are, the person calms down. What does that staff do? We all know somebody like that, right? They help them to express their emotion. They listen and they respect and they see them. Remember that group that I was sitting there with at the church, invisible? That wonderful staff who can work with anyone knows how to see, knows how to hear, knows how to validate their existence. You count. You're important. You don't have to use your behavior. You don't have to be so triggered. You feel safe now. And you're safe with people who care about you. We all know that. When you have a boss who likes you and cares about you, you do so much better than when you have a boss who doesn't like you and you think you might get fired any minute because they're always telling you what's wrong with you. You actually do worse in those situations, don't you? So when we just look at the behavior, we mix the whole picture. There's trauma responses and there's behavior responses. So I'm going to tell you a story about a woman. We'll call her Judy. And Judy had trauma, right? But here's the difference between a trauma response and a behavioral response. We've talked a lot. When we do a functional assessment, we assume that person is deliberately performing a behavior to get a result. That's what the functional assessment is. That's the paradigm of it. That you have an antecedent, you have a behavior, and you have a consequence, right? Now, sometimes that's how it is, because when people have absolutely no power in their life, they try to figure out how to get power. I would too. They're saying, okay, this is the situation. Maybe if I do this, I can get what I need because I'm not getting what I need otherwise. And when we do a functional assessment, that's right in line with that assumption and that paradigm. Because we look at why that person did what they did and what are they trying to get? Are they getting attention? Are they escaping? Are they, getting some kind of stimulation? Is there communication? deliberate communication. Everything inadvertently communicates. But are they actually playing a charades game? Sounds like, looks like, I'm angry. Now, for years, I assumed that most of the behavioral issues I dealt with, about 90% were behavioral, people trying to get something, do something. So we would give them a reward for not doing it, teach them that alternate behavior, reinforce that alternate behavior, reward them for doing that other thing, like asking for what they needed. But I making the assumption that that behavior was to get something. Now, but when we look at a trauma response, that behavior is very often just triggered in an irrational manner. Like Danny responding to the program manager walking in the room with the blonde hair. She's going to hurt me. And then he's throwing chairs, right? It's irrational. Like Linda, if that's what I called her, cutting herself, not looking for attention, saying, I hate myself. I've been rejected. And she said, I hate myself and a cutting makes me feel better. Yeah, you release endorphins, but there's a whole lot of ways to do that. And she was symbolically acting out her own hate. So that trauma response is often irrational. It can be triggered. It's triggered by something that hits that amygdala, and the amygdala says, oh no, this is bad, I'm in danger, or I'm going to get hurt, and the best defense is a good offense, or I'll turn it on myself. It's often an overreaction to a small event. It doesn't serve that person well, and it doesn't move things forward. Whereas often with the behavioral response, we'll see people get what they need. And so there's a difference. And now I think it's about 90% trauma and 10% behavioral. So Judy, I'll tell you about Judy. So Judy was raised in a rural area, and she was the child with a disability, not really cared for, not looked after, and her brother began sexually abusing her. And then he brought his friends and they gang raped her in the barn. So Judy burned the barn down. Go Judy. I probably would have too. But of course, what happens, right? We all know. She gets labeled a fire setter. She tells on him. No one believes her. And she gets put in the institution because she's so dangerous. And she spends many years there. And then we take her in our agency, bring her into our agency. And we have a very restrictive plan that checks her backpack for matches because we think she might set fires because that's her label. Mea culpa. I'm sorry. I wrote a lot of bad plans. And we, without knowing it, we kind of shame her and set the staff up to be shaming her. And then the staff really runs with that. And the staff makes fun of her, makes fun of her to the other people living in the house. Oh, we don't want Judy to set a fire. Judy, you better not do this. And she demeans her. And finally, we get therapy for Judy, and somebody I'm supervising starts doing the therapy with her. And she says to me, Judy hates her staff, and Judy wants to move. And I go to the executive directors. We really got to move Judy. She's really upset with the staff, and we've talked to the staff, but they're not really working with her in a way that she feels, safe. She says they hate me. They make fun of me. Judy runs away on a regular basis. And one day that staff makes fun of her one too many times, and Judy flips out. She breaks lamps, she turns over tables, and she breaks the brand new flat screen TV, which we had just gotten one in every house. Oh my. And guess what they did? Moved her. Oh yeah. But that wasn't Judy's intent. It was great that happened, but she just couldn't take one more minute of being demeaned, and she was carrying this great burden of her life along with her and never feeling heard or listened to or respected. So she moves, she goes to a much better place. She's doing great. And she has a little seminar at the day program. I've seen her, I saw her. She gathers people and she's telling them, Do you want to move? Break your TV. True story. The next 4 months, 3 TVs got broken, and there was another one after that, and they all got moved. And I told the executive director, I said, we could have saved some money just listening to people. And one time I gave this talk and he was there, and I said to myself, should I say it? And I did, because you're getting to know that's the kind of person I am. I'll just put it all out there. But I was nice. I said, I didn't want to move her either. Wink, wink, right? He's gotten better. And she has a boyfriend and she's doing well and she likes the home that she's in, which is her home, thank you, not the staff's. People do heal, but we have to make sure they feel safe and feel respected and feel connected and empowered, right? That they have real choices. And she finally felt like someone had listened. I wish we'd listened sooner. So that's the difference between the trauma response and the behavioral response. The other guys were like, bam, 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 I'm breaking my TV. I want to move. I want to move. That was very deliberate and intentional. And it moved them forward. If I had no power in my life, I'd be doing the same thing. So I would like to talk about the 4 symptom areas of trauma, of PTSD, briefly, so we can look at the fact that, yeah, we are seeing it sometimes when we don't even realize we're seeing it. That's the truth. So first is re-experiencing. We saw Dan re-experiencing some abuse every time he saw that program manager. That was a flashback. People have nightmares. How many of you work with someone with nightmares? Right? And I'm not talking about the normal kind that we all have, that many of us have had more of with COVID. I'm talking about repeated nightmares over and over in that loop, right? That's a symptom of PTSD. How about re-experiencing? How many of you know or work with somebody who talks over and over about someone who died? My mother died, and you think they just died, and then you find out they died 20 years ago, but that person is reliving it again and again and again, right? I see a lot of that, where they're in that negative loop where the past is present. That's a symptom of trauma. When you see someone who's constantly talking about something in the past and they're constantly reliving it as though it's happening or it just happened, then that person has PTSD. Avoidance. We see people have phobias so that the bad thing won't happen again, or become obsessed. Sometimes people are misdiagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorders when they're really just obsessed with staying safe. So I have another story about Dan, and this is about his roommate. So Dan's roommate had autism, and a lot of times we see people with autism when they are in danger or they've been triggered or they have PTSD, their obsessions and their rituals go sky high and they start performing them constantly. To me, that's a symptom of PTSD. And I've seen it many times when the rituals intensify. There's something wrong. So Charles came into the program one day. He always would come in and touch the fountain several times. It was his little thing. And you'd have to help him with his belt. And then he was fine. But he came in on a Monday and he was touching the fountain for an hour. We were helping him with his belt for another hour. Nothing was right. He was so off. And then he would sometimes jump a little. He jumped for hours and wouldn't even stop to eat lunch. And he did this day after day for the first week. And we were like, what's up? What's up? So then we call the residential. So something's wrong with Charles. Something's wrong with Charles. And we say, because we're so smart, I say it. Oh, he had his obsessive compulsive disorders really flaring up. He's decompensating and we got to go to the psychiatrist and get his meds increased. Go to the psychiatrist, get the meds increased, but nothing changes. He's doing this day after day for weeks. Then his housemate, who was Dan, musters all the courage he has and says to us one day, very upset, Joe is doing the boom boom. He's doing the boom boom to Charles. He's doing it to him. He's doing it to him. He tried to do it to me and I punch him and punch him and punch him. Charles was being sexually abused by staff. And Dan described it with the best words he could. I told you he had 10 words, right? But he did it. He did it. And we called the residents. We said, you better call the police. We showed up there. Police came. They had that staff who was the accused person sitting right there, and no one would say anything. Dan couldn't say anything. He was cowering in fear, no matter how much we encouraged him. And the police did nothing, of course, right? And we raised hell. We called licensing. We did everything we could. That staff was moved from the house, but he wasn't fired. And it took months for Charles to finally calm down. And finally, he went back to his baseline of just touching. But then another day, he came in and was right back there. And we called. Charles is seeming very upset again. What's going on there? And they said that same staff was substituting over the weekend. I'm glad to say that agency was shut down because they did a number of other things bad and they were shut down. But the horrible abuse that goes on behind closed doors. And we don't know what we don't know, but we can see the symptoms of trauma. And when these rituals are heightened and people become completely obsessed, oftentimes there's a reason. In fact, I venture to say when any behavior starts up out of nothing or increases in a very severe, significant way, something is going on, right? This is common sense. Same with us. We're all human. But definitely there's always a reason, and often it's some kind of trauma, something's going on. I've seen it many times, and you probably have too. Another symptom area is negative alteration in cognition and mood, which is really a lot of words for a sense of impending doom, where people feel like, oh no, everything is horrible, nothing good will ever happen again. Right now, I am doing therapy with a number of people with a sense of impending doom who say, I'll never have a good life, nothing will ever be okay, I'll never get out of this house, I'll never see my girlfriend or my or whoever again, because of COVID. The many people I talk to just don't feel like anything's ever going to be okay. And that's one of the reasons why I say we're going to be dealing with the repercussions of this for a while. Arousal, that hyper aroused state in which people are breaking things or freaking out or running into the road or jumping out of cars. All these states, all these behaviors are often from the amygdala filling that brain up with chemicals, which worked really well when we were in the jungle, but isn't doing too good right now, saying you're in danger, run, fight, do. And we have nowhere to run, nowhere to go. So we just do something reckless and dangerous. And we see a lot of behavioral issues that are really symptoms of hyperarousal in that area of PTSD. Okay. We often see the body storing the trauma. That's what Bessel van der Kolk talks about, that we see that. And it's so important to do body work and to be able to release it, because we see a lot of gastrointestinal issues, a lot of stomach problems, digestive problems with people that have a lot of anxiety and a lot of fear and a lot of trauma. It goes right to the stomach. Phantom pains, exaggerated pain response, because the body is saying, I'm in pain, and that pain may be psychic. Oftentimes people are telling us something's wrong and we can't find anything physically wrong, but their experience of pain is real. That's what Eisenberger showed us, right? Exclusion, trauma actually can be experienced as physical pain. Stephen Hawking says, the greatest enemy of knowledge is not ignorance, it's the illusion of knowledge. And that's where I made my mistakes. That's where I wrote bad behavior plans, because I thought I knew. Oh, that person just wants attention, and we're going to tell them we're only going to talk to them when they can ask quietly for what they need. No, that person is re-experiencing a trauma that happened to them and having a flashback or whatever. He also said time travel may be possible. It's just not practical. That actually has nothing to do with anything. I just thought it was so cool. What? Time travel is possible? It's definitely not practical because when you come back, everybody's dead. Not good. So, and we see a lot with autism and trauma. I saw Temple Grandin speak, and she said, I'm going to show you a picture of my brain. And she said, here's a picture of a brain of someone with autism. My amygdala is enlarged and my hippocampus is shrunk. And those of you who've been listening knows that's trauma. You guys know that's the brain of a person with trauma. And if you saw the movie, Temple Grandin, you saw how bullied she was, how excluded she was. Even she had a wonderful mom. She had a great family, but she was still really traumatized through school. It's very tough to have autism and go through the world. Sensory issues are traumatizing. There's a lot of little t trauma. And then there's the bullying. There's the exclusion. You know, I don't know if any of you have seen the series Love on the Spectrum. So it's beautiful. And I have a clip that I show sometimes when I can master the technology, where they talk about being bullied. And every single person in the show has an experience of being excluded and bullied. And many of them talk about still dreaming about it, still thinking about it, still feeling traumatized by it. It's very difficult, very, very difficult. Another wonderful show I've been watching. See, I've been spending a lot of time watching Netflix, drinking Chardonnay and watching Netflix. Thank you, COVID. And Atypical is a really great. It's like it's just a family show, but it really revolves around a teenage son with autism, and they get it. They get it right. And you can see the trauma that he goes through just having the sensory issues. And he's very smart, but doesn't understand social cues, right? And that in itself is traumatizing, let alone many of the folks that we support who don't have the language, who really struggle with that. They're very, very smart. I say for everybody we work with, assume intelligence, always. I know a man who has autism, and he says there's exquisite sensitivity and unseen intelligence, and that makes it really painful to live in the world. It gives them a lot of trauma. So oftentimes we're seeing trauma responses when people have meltdowns. Not something they're doing deliberately to get something. And that's why some of the interventions don't always work, because it's really an emotional response, not a manipulation. Staff have trauma. And this is a difficult reality, right? First of all, there's secondary trauma, and that's why we need trauma-informed management, because we need to support the staff that we're asking to work with folks who have trauma, who have a meltdown, who have issues, who need support on so many levels. And then we all bring our own history to our job. I'll never forget when I worked with this guy, and one of the guys he was working with, a person with a disability, came up behind him and put his hands over his eyes. And this guy, the staff person, had been in Iraq and had had a really bad experience in Iraq. And he flipped out. He grabbed him by the throat. He jacked him up to the wall. And we had to stop and get him down, and because he thought he was back in Iraq and someone had attacked him. So that's an extreme example, but I've worked with several people who've had extreme trauma responses from having been vets and in combat. But then there are the smaller examples where the staff have their own issues and where they need the support. And sometimes people lose their jobs when they don't know what they don't know. They don't know how something's going to affect them. And I think when we have that face-to-face supervision and we have trauma-informed management, we can give support on the level that's needed, not therapy, but to really help people to feel safe enough that they can express what they're having a problem with, or what might be tough for them, or what they're going through. I think it's very difficult in our field that we often, for the awake overnight staff and the weekend staff, they often don't have face-to-face supervision. And I know a number of agencies getting away from house managers because they're expensive. And so you have one coordinator supervising 6 homes. And so nobody sees their supervisor. And people tend to feel very isolated that way. And then we're asking them to give on an emotional level, on a physical level, to do the hardest work there is in our field of being the direct support professional, and without the support. So I think we have to really rethink things and look at how we can have that support. And any incident needs to be debriefed. People need someone to talk to, and they need to be able to go to a safe place and talk in a way that they're not instantly reprimanded for what they should have done, but where they can really debrief and process. And then later we can talk about how to approach things. But we've got to figure out how to support staff, I think, if we're going to be effective in dealing with the trauma of the folks that we support. And the families have trauma. Families have trauma. I'll never forget, I was at this meeting. It was a meeting of, gosh, there was this woman, they had their son. It was a husband and wife. They were both doctors, right? They are both doctors. And very intimidating, super smart, MD. She's like nationally known for her work. She has a specific area that she's done great things in. And their son has regressive autism. So that's a trauma. At 1.5, he stopped talking. He regressed. He stopped walking, lost all his skills. And I've had so many families say to me, oh, that's when we lost him. That's a trauma on the family. And then this young man, developed, and when he hit adolescence and those hormones kicked in, he became aggressive, putting holes in the wall, punching, throwing things, and got really big. And they put him in a residential setting. And he was there until he was 21. And then he came to the agency where I was working. And they were, first of all, they were very upset with us because we would not restrain him. And I won't let any agency that I work in, where I sign the behavior plans or do any kind of supervision, use restraints as part of the plan. Restraints re-traumatize people. They're a source of trauma. And then what happens is we really undermine the staff, because when the staff has that person's trust, that person feels safe and they calm down. But when that staff restrains that person and puts hands on them in a way the person doesn't want, all of a sudden that staff person becomes unsafe. And it often takes weeks and months to rebuild the trust. And I know that from many, many years ago, being part of a restraint where I was doing therapy with a man, and we were making so much progress. He had been sexually abused by his stepfather, and he had told, and his mother had cut him off. And we had come so far in doing the trauma work. But then one day he stole some food, and he accidentally hit someone as he was running away with the food because he had some eating issues. Hey, I've got some food issues myself. And they restrained him, and they asked for help. And I came and I was holding his leg, and he looked at me. I'll never forget that look. Et tu, Brute? Like I had just stabbed him in the heart, and we never got to the therapy that we were doing before. I could never get back to that trust. We had very superficial sessions after that, and we've been making such progress. And that's when I realized, these restraints are re-traumatizing people, and there's 100 ways of getting around it, right? So they insisted we restrain him, and we said, we're not going to restrain him. And what do you know? We didn't need to. Once we tell that person, we work with the person over and over again, like, you're safe here. We're not going to do that. If you want to run, run. But we'll, if there's an emergency restraint so somebody doesn't get into the road, yeah. But that's not part of the plan. And then we explain to them, we care about you, we didn't want you to get hurt. But other than that, we're not restraining you in your own home. We're not restraining you in your day program. We're talking to you, or if you're having a bad day, we're letting you sit and we're clearing the area. And a lot of times we're giving you hugs, but I know that's a little controversial. Pressured hugs in his case, and he really loved them. We started doing a lot of pressured hugs and wrapping him with weighted blankets and all kinds of things that they hadn't done in the residential program. But in any case, he still was putting holes in the wall from time to time, and he had a bad relationship with his housemate, and they were together in the residence, and we thought they would want to be together, but we were wrong. They hated each other. And the families were saying, oh, this is great, they're going to love to be together, but they actually hated each other. So he would put holes in the wall. He never hit him, which to his credit. So there we are. And he's put a bunch of holes in the wall, and we're at his meeting. And we say there's a lot of holes in the wall, and we're renting this house, or, this is his home, but it's being rented, and the landlord's not happy. And we're thinking about trying to figure out, should we put plywood and then the wall, or what should we do here? We're trying to figure out how to not destroy this home. And we're talking about this. And all of a sudden, this mother, who's a nationally known doctor in her area, bursts into tears and starts sobbing. I mean, this is a very professional woman, usually fairly cold to us, doesn't like us very much because we're not doing the things they say we should do all the time. Sobbing. And we're all quiet, like, oh my God. And her husband does not comfort her. He's like this, like he's having his own trauma response. And I thought, oh my God, they're so traumatized. He goes like this, and he freezes, and she's crying hysterically. And then she says, you're going to discharge him. Well, he'd been kicked out of a number of programs and schools before he ended up in that residential program. And he'd been discharged before. And that was her trauma. I had another mom say to me, when my daughter was suspended, it was like I was suspended. And I looked at her and I said, no, this is what we do. Holes in the wall are us. We've got this. And she, you're probably going to kick him out. And no, we didn't. But boy, did I see that family had some serious trauma. And then I understood all the power struggles, all the back and forth, all the difficulties that we'd had. That's when I saw, we need to not only work with that person, we have to work with that person's family and understand that oftentimes we're working with a traumatized family system. And that's the reality. 3 ingredients for healing that I firmly believe in. Everybody programmatically needs to live somewhere where they feel safe. That's perception of safety. I know one agency I worked at, we had the director of safety, we had earthquake drills, fire drills, you name it, we had a drill for it. We were really safe, and no one went anywhere and no one did anything because we made sure we were staying safe. But folks didn't feel safe. Sometimes they had staff yelling at them. Their staff were frustrated because they were always getting in trouble if they did anything wrong. And they didn't feel safe. Safety is an emotional issue. So we need to look at, how can we support people in feeling safe? How can we support people in having lots of relationships, lots of connections? Because this is how people heal from trauma. To have many relationships that are unpaid. We used to always take surveys at my last job to make sure that our folks had friends. And we'd say, who's your friend? And they'd say, my staff. And those staff never stayed forever, very rarely. And if they did, they're not just calling them up to go to the movies with them, usually. No, real friends, real relationships, significant others. This is how we heal. And then empowerment, real choices. I want to ask all of you, if anybody's left, Can you remember your least favorite job for the three of you still listening? What was your least favorite job? Do you remember it? Because mine was Friendly's Ice Cream in Bethel, Connecticut. I was a waitress there. I was always covered with fudge ripple ice cream. They stole our tips. We were freezing cold, and they were mean. And there were always a lot of kids screaming very loudly. By themselves, they were cute, but in a mob, not so good. And oh, I hated that job. All right, you're all remembering and thinking about your least favorite job? Now, I want to ask you, do you remember quitting it? Isn't that a happy day? Or maybe you were fired. Thank you so much for firing me, right? What if you quit that job and the next day a van came up to your house and there was a staff person in your home giving you a lunch and saying, have a good day. And that van took you back to the job. And you said, but I quit that job. And they said, yeah, we know. Yeah, you quit. And then the next day the van comes and takes you back to your job and you come home, you say, I quit. Today I'm really quitting. And they say, yeah, you quit your job. And the van comes and 20 years later, you're still going to that job. That's called no power, no control. And that can be really frustrating. And I'd be having a behavior too if I were still at Friendly's. I'd be having many behaviors. People need some power. They need to be able to have agency, the ability to move their own life forward, to have choices, right? So they need to feel safe, emotionally supported, connected with friends and relationships, and choice and power that truly impacts their life, not just compliance. And that's how people really truly heal. And that's programmatic. We're not even starting to talk about therapy. Just programmatically speaking, if these things are in place, people heal. And then we can talk about therapeutic supports. And so tomorrow we will be talking about the healing process, therapy, all the different aspects of how we can treat and support people. And most importantly, what trauma-informed care really means. So thank you for all of your support and for listening.